All right, everybody, we're going to get started with our next session, and we'll start pushing people in here. We've got a couple folks that are going to be up there. David Downs. David's going to be moderating this session, handling all the Q&A. David is a cannabis journalist, co-author of The Marijuana Harvest.
Hi, guys.
Hello, thanks for joining us.
And presenting, Jessica Lukas, VP of Consumer Insights for BDS Analytics. And I'll just say that this is one I was really excited about, is really trying to understand who the cannabis consumer is and how it relates to wine. And Jessica, we'll let you take it from here.
Perfect.
All right.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'd just like to start with level setting, cannabis and alcohol. There are different perceptions, there are different stigmas, there are different occasions of use. And interestingly, we can think of two common words, waking up and consuming cannabis, generally accepted. Waking up and drinking, maybe not so much unless you're going to brunch. On the flip, a marijuana mom versus a wine mom. I love this example. I am a mom and I consume cannabis. And I have friends, and I'm from Indiana, and my friends get on social media after the kids go to sleep, and they hashtag send more wine, drinking a bottle of wine, whatever they want to say on social media, and that is generally accepted. I live in Colorado. Again, I'm from Indiana, a very illicit state. I'm actually from the hometown of Mike Pence. But if I got online and posted something on social media that my kid is in bed and I consumed cannabis, a lot of people would want to call Child Protective Services on me. We have to understand the products are different, the use cases are different, the perceptions are different, and the stigmas are different. Additionally, we have medical use cases versus social recreational use cases, and I'll talk about this in more detail. There's a significant number of cannabis occasions for consumers in need states and purposes for consuming that aren't a situation in which alcohol played, will play, or will ever play. This isn't a black or white conversation. This isn't a one-for-one. Every additional dollar spent on legal cannabis is not a dollar taken away from alcohol. So with that, let's start with topic number one. I always like to say this. Legal cannabis is new. Cannabis is not new for most people. Alcohol and cannabis have coexisted for a very long time. And understanding what does being legal mean, what does that mean in terms of consumer evolution, consumer adoption, and product evolution is important, and we'll speak to that. There are risks to alcohol. A lot of cannabis consumers do consume alcohol, and we'll talk about what that picture looks like. But there are also opportunities. So let's just start with the fact that legal cannabis is growing. We do projections as BDS Analytics. We project out for the next 5 years the size of the marketplace. In 2017, we were about $9 billion. We've actually updated our back projections, so that number's closer to $9.5 billion. Looking in the next 5 years to be 25 to 30 billion, and that does not account for any major changes in legalization. That does not assume federal legalization. That does not assume federal decriminalization. That does not assume any major states shift in where they currently are. So that is a very conservative estimate. What's interesting is as we think about that growth over time, and what you're looking at here are lines for adult use versus medical markets for Colorado and Oregon, and then you see a line for Washington adult use. We're also tracking quite a few other states, but I'm just showing you this because we have history. But I like to focus on the far end, the green lines. So you have Colorado adult come online January 2014. It took about 6 months for it to meet the volume of the medical markets, and since that point, we've seen adult use continue to grow, and we've seen medical markets remain relatively flat until 2018. And in both Colorado and Oregon, we are seeing a decline in those medical markets. So again, thinking about the growth, where is that coming from? A lot of the growth, not surprising, in cannabis sales are coming from the adult use markets. Further, looking at evolution, again, we have data across a lot of the legal markets, but I like to look at Colorado, because Colorado, we have 4.5 years of data, because adult use came online January 2014. So as you think about consistent regulations and trends over time, it's really insightful to look at what has happened in Colorado. So Q1 2014, flower accounted for 70% of dollar sales. Fast forward to Q4 2017, and flower is below 50% of dollar shares. So what does that mean? We're talking about an evolution, a shift in the products that people are buying, and a shift in pricing as well. I'm assuming most of you know there is a declining trend in the price per gram of flower, and that is impacting this dollar share. But what we're seeing is an evolution in new product forms, new methods, and a shift in what people are buying from a primarily flower market and seeing a lot of growth in concentrates, both vape and dabbable products, and then also a lot more product offerings, a lot more brands in edibles. So quickly, this will be the 1-minute spiel on who BDS Analytics is and why you should listen to what I say. We are retail sales tracking, consumer insights, and a data analytics firm. We started focused on cannabis, and we only focus on cannabis. At a very, very high level, we partner with dispensaries. We tap into their back-end point-of-sale systems. We pull the data in-house. We clean it, we categorize it, we code it, we match it, and we project it. So our clients can log into our system and say, I want to look at Colorado edibles, edibles down to beverages, beverages down to drinks, drinks down to carbonated drinks down to individual brands and SKUs, what is selling where, when, and for what price point. So those trend lines I just showed you, that is coming from the very detailed and granular retail sales tracking data. We also do consumer research. And with our consumer research, we don't want to just look at demographics, because demographics aren't very telling in how people behave. So our focus with everything we do on consumer is looking at attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and an evolution of the consumer marketplace over time. So not only are we talking to cannabis consumers today, we're also talking to non-consumers and assessing what are the hurdles that they face, why do they not consume, and how does that pie shift over time. Everything we do on both of these is tracking what is happening in the market today, brands, categories, products, consumers. More importantly, it's all trending. So to be able to predict what will happen in the future, we have all of our data trending so we can see the evolution over time of how we got to where we are today. So very helpful in being able to predict what will happen. So hopefully none of you believe this, but some still think that this is what a dispensary looks like. Interestingly, I was speaking at a beer conference, so I can say this since everybody in here hopefully are wine or cannabis people, and I sat next to a man at lunch and he said, oh, you're the weed lady. I said, yes, I guess, and he said, I live in Washington, and my immediate thought was, oh, it's a legal market, you know what's going on, and he said, what's new in cannabis since the 1970s? You can still smoke it, right? And I laughed because I thought he was joking. And he was like, no, really, like what's different? And that was a good eye-opener for me because we're living and breathing this every day, that even people who live in legal markets have no idea what this industry is about. So always important to remember that some still think this is what a dispensary experience might be. In reality, showing just 3 different examples in the Colorado market, the experience is very much normalized. Just like any retail setting, obviously we have more premium luxury experiences, more mainstream experiences, and admittedly some more budget strip mall type experiences. Just like, again, any retail setting, we do see a trend towards more value tiering. Further, branded products. Branded products in Colorado, again, Colorado a good gauge for trends over time. Branded products in Colorado now account for about 40% of the market. Very telling, and I'll get to some additional data behind this later, but very telling that people are looking and seeking for consistency, trustworthy products, a specific experience, and for a lot of people, brands provide that consistency. And people are really asking for that. They want consistent dosages, they want to know how they're going to feel and what that experience will be like, and they want to know that that experience is the same every single time. Interesting to call out here though, the generic bucket, that does include dispensary branded products, which just like in the general market, we can all agree, a Trader Joe's branded product, a Safeway, a Kroger, those products also have a reputation for consistency. So there's a lot there with that generic bucket that you're seeing that still could be considered branded products, something consumers understand and know what they're going to get. Sophisticated CPG-like product offerings exist. Packaging, the look, the labels, the branding. We're not just talking again about weighted flower anymore. Further, celebrity endorsements. This is just 2 examples, Leafs by Snoop and Marley. I'm sure many of you are aware of these products. What's interesting about celebrity endorsements is they have a lot of awareness. People know that these products exist. the people who are out there with these endorsed products fit the cannabis lifestyle. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time as it becomes more mainstream. Do we see more mainstream celebrities getting into this business as well? And topic of the day, I feel, is beverages. So what does the beverage market look like within cannabis? And just throwing up a few different examples here. For those of you who are not familiar with cannabis beverages, what's interesting to me, coming from a background within consumer packaged good and beverage alcohol, is that although most of these products on the screen look like they're single serve, 14, 16, 20 ounces, most of them in fact are not single serve. So in one 14, 16, 20 ounce bottle, you have 100 milligrams of THC with some sort of dosage mechanism, whether it's the medicine cap, like the Can-A-Punch example, or actually the lid being used as your dosage. That's important to call out because we have to think about the cannabis beverage market today is less than 1% of retail sales. So edibles account for about 15% of dollar sales. Beverages account for 5 to 7%, depending on the state market, of edibles. Nets us down to less than 1% of dollar sales coming from beverages. That's not to say this isn't a growing, evolving category, but it's important to call out that when you think about cannabis beverages in market today, most of them are not single serve, sit down, consume the whole thing like we're used to in other beverage categories. Further beverages, let's just call out all of the big announcements. The Lagunitas product launching this week, Two Roots, and then you have your big players, the Saria Beverages, which is the founder, brewer of Blue Moon, Molson Coors, Constellation Brands, a lot of big plays happening, a lot of press behind these products, a lot of interest of what are these going to bring to the table. From what I know that has been released, most of these products are going to be lower dose. So we are truly going to have single serve products that are less than 5 milligrams per bottle. The question is, how do you present this to a dispensary? How do you get this sold through when the price equation to THC is going to be very different than what people are used to in the market today? So there definitely are challenges, but a lot of interesting components to these products and providing something that's from a trusted brand, consistency, and experience that you know what you're going to get. Hold on a second. And product trends over time, really high level, let's just call out a few. I'm not gonna talk about gummy candy. Low dose edibles, extremely fascinating space to think about, especially giving consumers the control over time. 100% a growing category. People want to either consume throughout the day and have control over that experience. Pharmaceutical-inspired forms, also very fascinating. So as you think about new consumers coming into this category or this industry and wanting a health, medical, wellness benefit, maybe consuming an inhalable or a chocolate or a gummy doesn't feel right. So these pharmaceutical-inspired formats, pills, tablets, capsules, nasal sprays, inhalers, even the dissolvable strips fit this kind of need occasion for those types of consumers. Further, we heard earlier talking about this mood, this experience, labeling the product for the type of experience a consumer will have is working for some brands. And it makes sense to a consumer who doesn't know strains, who doesn't know species or classes. Admittedly, a lot of people don't even know the difference between THC and CBD or sativa indica hybrid. I mean, a lot of people don't know those differences. And so going into a dispensary and understanding I am looking for this type of experience and that's what the product says I'm going to get is easy for a consumer to understand. And obviously we're seeing a lot of brands playing in this space. So let's talk about the cannabis consumer. In general, across the entire US, adults 21 plus, 83% agree that there should be some form of legal marijuana usage. What's really fascinating about this number, and I'll get into this in more detail, is we segment the US into 5 stages of legalization. So from illicit to CBD only, to restricted medical, to open medical, to fully adult use medically legal. This 83% spans across all 5 of those stages in the US between 80 and 90%. So again, this isn't just legal markets driving this number. This is the entire US 21 plus population driving this 83%. Further, 64% agree that there are medical benefits to marijuana use. I like that this is interesting, but in Canada, this number is lower. So fascinating to me that Canada passed federal legalization without being as convinced as the US population that cannabis has medical application. Further, it says 50 shades of green. I swear in my normal template, these are green colors, so we'll just say 50 shades of blue here. But again, looking at the US and segmenting it into 5 stages of legalization is how we think about the evolution of the marketplace over time. And as we look at those 5 stages, again, level 5 being illicit, so states like Indiana fall into that bucket, all the way to level 1 legal, which is going to be California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Alaska. And DC is in there, but I don't really want to talk about DC because it's a confusing factor that we argue about internally about where it should fall in these 5 stages. But regardless, the evolution of consumers, products, brands, and product assortment over time shifts attitudes. So you go from level 5 states illicit, and we can all agree there are people consuming in those states, and a fairly hefty portion of people consuming in those states, with limited product availability, limited assortment, limited education. As you move through the 5 stages, what we see is an evolution in consumer understanding, destigmatization, greater product assortment, method assortment, which changes the way people act, behave, and perceive cannabis. So as we think about those level 1 states, again, Alaska, California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and Nevada, 32% of adults 21 plus in those states have consumed cannabis in the past 6 months. What's fascinating about this number is that Oregon has remained relatively flat around 35 to 36%. Washington jumped from 30 to 35%. Colorado jumped from 25 to 35% in the last year. All of a sudden, we have 3 major markets falling between 35 to 40% of the adult 21 plus population consuming. I hypothesize, we'll see in the next 2 months, that we might have hit a little bit of a stalling point. Do we stall here at this 35 to 40% before something big happens that causes this continual wave that potentially starts moving us closer to the 65 to 75% of the adult 21 plus population who consumes alcohol? But we're still seeing, even in a market like Colorado, between Q1 2017 to Q1 2018, as I said earlier, a 10 percentage point bump. So there still is constant evolution in the marketplace. As I mentioned earlier, we're not just talking to cannabis consumers, we're also talking to non-consumers because we're sizing the consumer marketplace. And so we break down non-consumers into acceptors, people who don't currently consume but are open to it, and rejectors, people who don't currently consume nor are they open to it. And what's interesting about thinking about those people are what are the hurdles, especially for acceptors, for those people to become consumers. And as I mentioned earlier, legal cannabis is new, cannabis is not new for most. So if we look at the other numbers on this slide, 60% of acceptors have consumed cannabis in the past. So in general, there's a lot of experience with cannabis consumption. And there's no one cannabis consumer. These people cross demographics, they cross genders, age, incomes. They also have very different motivations or need states for utilizing cannabis in their daily lives. So who are they? They're men and women, average age of 40. So right there, men and women, average age of 40. For those who are not in the industry, that immediately starts debunking the stoner stereotype. Men and women, average age of 40. We're not talking, and I work and live in Boulder, Colorado, so we're not talking about a 22-year-old male living in his parents' basement, as Bill was explaining, wearing a tie-dye t-shirt, laying on the couch and consuming cannabis all day. Men and women, average age of 40, they work full-time, they live in cities, they have kids, they're married, they actually enjoy the outdoors, they're more socially and physically active than non-consumers in those same states. I love to call this one out. They're also more satisfied with life than non-consumers. And as we think about how they consume, I showed you some market share information. What's fascinating as we think again about the evolution over time is that inhalables, both concentrates, vape, dabbables, and also flower and pre-rolls account for about 80% of dollar share. But when we ask consumers, what is your preferred method, we see a shift in these numbers. So 80% dollar shares inhalables, preference for inhalables is 72%. Edibles accounts for about 15% of dollar share, but 23% of cannabis consumers prefer edibles. So as we, again, think about the future, where this is going, we're going to see a continued evolution. What drives the difference in preference versus market share is the fact that inhalable consumers tend to be heavier consumers, who purchase more frequently and consume more frequently, driving that dollar share to be higher when we look at actual sales in the market. And like I said earlier, consumption is multifaceted. We have to break out of just thinking, and I don't think anyone in this room thinks this, that cannabis is just about getting high. For a lot of people, there are recreational and social benefits, and there's health, medical, wellness benefits, and I will say the lines are very blurry between the two. It's like the chicken or the egg situation, right? Like the lines are very blurry. And when we ask people what are their primary reasons for consuming, a lot of it is about relaxation benefits, to relax and be mellow, to manage anxiety, to manage stress, to sleep better, to feel peaceful. And for those of you in the wine industry, I love calling out the fact here that if you told somebody that you consume alcohol to help you sleep better or to relieve anxiety or depression, people might think you have a problem. But if you say you use cannabis for those reasons, people are generally accepting of that. So again, going back to what I said originally, the perceptions are different and they're different for a reason. Also worth calling out here, what this means is throughout any given day, the time of day of the week, the situation, who you're with, the reason you consume cannabis can be changing drastically, constantly evolving. For most consumers, it isn't, I only consume for social reasons, and in that occasion, I vape. There is a lot more complexity around that. We see that consumers are consuming inhalables, edibles, and topicals. And all of those are driven by the occasion and the need state. So topicals throughout the day, every day for pain management. Many consumers use a gummy or an edible at night to help them sleep. With inhalables fitting in a lot of situations as well, again, it's a constant evolution. I threw this in here because I believe there's a few tourism companies here, and as we think about visiting wineries and what does pot tourism mean, I wanted to call out a few new numbers I haven't shared, but 60% of past 2-year cannabis consumers across the US are more likely to choose cannabis-friendly destinations, and 18% of US adults in general are more likely to choose cannabis-friendly destinations. And in the last year, 17% of US adults have traveled to a state or country where cannabis is legal, and while there, 30% consumed legal cannabis. So there's something here that we always have to consider as well. And we'll get into more data about alcohol versus cannabis. But there's something here in terms of taking advantage of people coming to your cities and your states for legal cannabis, because they also drink alcohol. So cannabis consumers, 72% of them also consume alcohol. I don't think that's surprising to anyone in the room. Further, as we break this down by spirits, beer, wine, and craft beer, what's fascinating to me in these numbers right now is wine is the only category where non-consumers actually are more likely to consume wine than cannabis consumers. I don't know if that's surprising or not to people in this room. It's not like there's a major difference here, but it is the only category. In beer, craft beer, and spirits, cannabis consumers are more likely to consume alcohol than non-cannabis consumers, but wine is the only one that differs. And as we break down that 41%, we think about what type of wine are they drinking, high level, just outlining a few different responses from consumers of the type of wine that they're consuming. And as we break down these people further, so identifying who is a wine consumer who also consumes cannabis, how does this person differ from the general cannabis consumer? They're more likely to be female. Average age of 40 is the same as I told you for the general cannabis consumer, but a wine plus cannabis consumer skews more female than the general cannabis consumer. Further, they're more likely to be college educated, and they're more likely to have a higher income. Interestingly, maybe not surprisingly, these people are very health motivated in their lives. They're worried about their personal health and they take care of their bodies. Fascinating though, they are less likely than the general cannabis consumer to consume cannabis for medical reasons. So while they're very focused on their personal health, they're not yet as convinced as the general cannabis consumer that cannabis plays an essential role in their personal health. They're more likely to consume over-the-counter sleep aids, anxiety medication, pain medication than any other cannabis consumer. Just fascinating to think about how this group differs from others. They're interested in socially and environmentally responsible brands in general. They enjoy fine arts. They enjoy yoga, Pilates. Those aren't as surprising, but again, they are very focused on their personal health, but less convinced that cannabis plays a role in their health. Further, their cannabis consumption to that point is more socially, recreationally driven. They consume cannabis less often. They purchase it less often than the general cannabis consumer. They're consuming it, again, primarily in social and recreational settings. They are very comfortable in a dispensary setting, and they like to feel like they're being catered to. I don't think that's surprising to anyone either. So as we think about alcohol and cannabis, the first thing, and I'm actually going to flip that back, the first thing I like to call out here, as we think about the use cases and the occasions, 50% of cannabis consumers don't even see alcohol and cannabis as fitting for the same occasions. So right off the bat, 50% of cannabis consumers do not see the two as interchangeable. That leaves us with the other 50% who says sometimes they're good for the same types of occasions, sometimes they're not. And a small sliver of this pie, the 12% saying yes, they're completely interchangeable. Think about those people as being 100% social recreational cannabis consumers. Further, only 15% say they often consume alcohol and cannabis in the same setting. This is often. If we break this down to people at any time, any frequency who consume the two together, we're looking closer at 50%. I love this because there's a lot of thought out there that the two are paired all the time and that there's a lot of overlap, which there is. But if we break this down further and look at other occasions or activities, movies and music, snacks, not surprising, most frequently paired. But I love calling out that fine dining and exercise are more often paired with cannabis than alcohol. So like just really eye-opening to think about how are people consuming this and where does it fit in their lifestyle, and cannabis is more likely to be paired with exercise and fine dining than alcohol. Admittedly, being a numbers person, those numbers aren't statistically significant, but we can still call that out. But when people do pair the two together, 54% drink less alcohol. So it's a Friday night, my kid's in bed, my husband loves documentaries, that's all he'll watch, so we have to watch a documentary. Maybe that used to be a wine, beer, spirits occasion. Now cannabis comes into play. You're pairing the two. Maybe you go from drinking 2 to 3 glasses of wine to having 1 or 2 because you're also consuming a vape or taking hit off a joint. So all of a sudden, you didn't lose an alcohol occasion, but you lost units of alcohol consumption. There are risks because when they are paired together, people consume less alcohol. Additionally, there are occasions, as I mentioned earlier, that are perceived as substitutable. So those are lost occasions. So you do have substitutable occasions as a risk to alcohol. You're trading off one or the other. I'm not saying that's going to happen for every consumer in every occasion, but there is a risk. Even if that happens twice a month for somebody, that is a lost beverage experience. Complementary occasions, as I mentioned, when they are paired together, a large majority of people consume less alcohol. So let's revisit the math really quick. 72% of cannabis consumers also consume alcohol. 53% see them as good for the same occasions, at least sometimes. Break that down. 38% of cannabis consumers see them as fitting for the same occasions, at least sometimes. That leads a pretty big percent of cannabis consumers who don't even consider alcohol and cannabis as directly competitive. Interesting. Revisiting the math on the other side, 72% of cannabis consumers also drink. That is really hard to see, but that's okay. 15% often pair cannabis with alcohol, and when they consume the two together, 54% drink less alcohol. Again, just showing you that as you think about the numbers, there is overlap, there is risk, but this is not black or white. This is not one or the other. So again, as we think about every dollar spent on legal cannabis pulling from somewhere, alcohol is impacted. Over-the-counter medications impacted. Pharmaceuticals are impacted. Health and beauty is impacted. Functional beverages are impacted. Tobacco is impacted. Coffee is impacted. So we can't just continue to have the conversation that the one who's carrying all this weight is alcohol. There's a lot happening here. So further, as we think about cannabis consumers who also consume alcohol, how has their behavior changed? 70% of people who consumed wine and cannabis claim they have not changed the amount of alcohol they consume because of their marijuana use. That leaves us still with 25% who are claiming they have decreased their alcohol consumption because of their cannabis use. Fascinating about that number, if you unpack it and you look at the people claiming to have decreased alcohol because of cannabis, their cannabis consumption is largely medically motivated. So we have to think about these people differently. What percent of those people would have left alcohol regardless? What's their reasoning? What's the driver here? Just high level, 3 groups that this is a factor for. Medically motivated, as I mentioned, are people who are decreasing their alcohol consumption. Holistic health-focused individuals, generally looking for health and wellness, they are decreasing how much alcohol they consume. Fascinating group that we're unpacking currently is younger adults. So all of a sudden, we have this group of individuals in legal states that are aging into becoming legal at 21 and never knowing a world at a legal age where cannabis wasn't legal. That group is fascinating. They also tend to have lower incomes. So as we think about a risk, we have to think about that group as well. Further, as we think about these evolution of brands and products and methods and consumers, we have to look at those acceptors, because acceptors don't currently consume cannabis, but they're open to it. Why don't they consume? Top 2 reasons. It does not fit my lifestyle, and I had a bad past experience. I don't like how it makes me feel. So going back to a point I made earlier, there has to be a component of trust that these people know the experience they're going to have, they understand what it's going to feel like, and that it is going to be a positive experience. So as more and more products come out focused on that message, we are going to see non-consumers becoming cannabis consumers, but they have to be convinced it is trustworthy and they'll have a good experience. Not surprising, because current cannabis consumers, biggest drivers of purchasing, THC content, price, okay, not super interesting, but a product I've tried before, a recommendation from a friend or family member, and a recommendation from a bud tender. So even among your current cannabis consumers, you're looking for trust. So with that was perfect timing, because this is the last slide. The objective here is to think about the need states, the occasions, the situations of consumption for both cannabis and alcohol, understanding the overlaps, the risks, but also the opportunities. Because every cannabis consumer has a different motivation, and as I said earlier, that typically is not consistent. It's changing throughout any given day, throughout any given week, dependent on who you're around and what your personal situation is of the method that you use to consume and why you're consuming that.
Listen to that science being dropped by BDS Analytics. Give a warm round of applause for Jess. She's got it all. BDS has it all. Are these slides going to be available to members of the audience?
I'm pretty sure the answer to that is yes.
Okay, so she just unpacked a lot of stuff for you guys. I'm David Downs. I'm a reporter with Leafly.com.
Do you want me to sit or stand?
We're out of time, so we're just going to stand and thank everybody. If you do want these slides, hit up Jess and BDS afterwards, and maybe she can email them to you. There's even more data to unpack in there, and there was some great questions. We'll just take the top one from the audience was, how much overlap exists between the cannabis and the wine consumer, just off the top of your head?
Yeah, and I showed that among cannabis consumers, and it's funny, I don't have the flip of the number, and I was actually trying to pull that in. So if you do have that question, follow up with me, and I can give you the opposite. So what I showed you earlier was 41% of cannabis consumers also drink wine. If you want the flip, what % of wine consumers also consume cannabis, let me know, and I can get you that number.
There you guys have it, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be keeping it going here.
Great job, Jessica. Thank you so much, David. Thank you. Jessica will be here, so don't be a stranger. Go up and say hello. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So we've got a 15-minute break. We're going to get started here at 11:30. Now we've got 2 sessions going on next. We've got a workshop in the small conference room. It's one of our, something new we're doing this year called Lessons from Wine. So we have a couple workshops where we're going to talk about some things that have been successful for the wine industry that the cannabis industry might want to look at. We're looking at direct consumer marketing and distributor management. And then the next session here is going to talk about cannabis tourism, and what the potential impact might be on wine. So we'll see you guys in 15 minutes. So.